Welcome back to the Dry Fasting Club. I'm Yannick Wolf, and today we're going to be talking about gout and dry fasting. So, gout is an extremely common problem nowadays. It's almost like every other person that's over 30 is dealing with some type of gout issues. And even if you're not, then you probably know somebody in your life that's dealing with gout. And you know why it's so important? It's so important because a lot of people that have come to dry fasting have come because they are metabolically sick and they have some sort of form of insulin resistance. And most people on this journey of trying to fix insulin resistance, unfortunately, walk off a little bit off the path. They veer the wrong way. They take one wrong turn and boom, they get hit with a form of gout. They don't know what's going on. And that's very common, so stick around. This is really important. Gout is basically, first and foremost, a form of insulin resistance. And most diseases, including things like cancer, all are insulin resistance at their root cause. Yes, and you can put a temporary pause with things like keto and carnivore diets, and that's what a lot of people do, and they feel so good. But what happens is day by day, skipping on carbs, you're just making yourself more and more insulin resistant. So if this is something you're interested in, stick around. Okay, our first thing is going to be called gout is not just about purines or kidney clearance. So the classic teaching about gout is that it's too much uric acid. And because there's too much uric acid, there's poor kidney excretion or overproduction of purines. And purines come from red meat, shellfish, alcohol. If you know anybody about gout, you know that they're usually like, oh, I can't eat red meat or I can't drink alcohol. And some of them will say, oh, sugar really messes me up. But that's rarer to be that self-aware and know so much about it that sometimes it's the sugar. And then if they really know, it's really about the insulin. So the reality of gout and everything is basically that 70 to 90% of gout patients actually have normal or even high urinary uric acid excretion. What does that mean? It means that they're just like you and me. We produce the same amount of uric acid. It's not that for some reason their body's messed up and they're producing more. No, it's that their body is unable to excrete it correctly. And that's why you hear people talk about things like, oh, drink a lot of water. Let's flush the whole body. Yeah, in a way, sometimes that's all that can work in an acute flare-up. You just need anything to flush it out. But that is not the root cause. The root cause is under excretion in the kidneys due to high insulin. And this is also why a keto diet can help so much because it lowers insulin. In the very beginning, you're going to have quite some trouble with flare-ups, but that's mainly because your body is kind of competing. Ketones and uric acid both compete to try to get out of the kidneys. So that's going to be your initial major hump. But once you break through that, it's going to be smooth sailing because you're not going to have high insulin levels. So the kidneys are going to be able to get rid of the uric acid much easier. So you actually notice that a lot of gout people self-medicate with things like a ketogenic diet and maybe more aggressively into carnivore. But unfortunately, once again, they're not addressing the root cause. You're not fixing the root cause. You're just helping with a temporary band-aid. So how does insulin resistance directly cause hyperuricemia? Hyperuricemia is basically what the name implies, high levels of uric acid. So insulin resistance leads to hyperinsulinemia, which is a little bit different than what we just said. It basically leads to high insulin. That's where the main problem occurs. Why? Because high insulin does two bad things in the kidneys. The first is it reabsorbs uric acid in the proximal tubules. So it's absorbing the uric acid. And two, it's not excreting the acid. Obviously, it makes sense. Oh, it's absorbing, so it's not going to excrete it, but it's actually a double mechanism. One, it reabsorbs it. Two, it doesn't even get rid of what's left. It'll reabsorb 50%, but the other 50% is not even coming out properly. You can imagine that as a traffic jam. One lane is bad enough that gets completely shut down. Now imagine you've got a 2-lane, maybe it's a 3-lane highway, and you've got 2 lanes blocked. Can you imagine how progressively hour over hour, how bad the backup's going to be? That's how you can imagine the system with gout. So there's actually multiple studies that show that you can improve insulin sensitivity, and with that, gout, by things like weight loss and metformin. These are sort of diabetic drugs, and diabetes is all based around insulin. So gout and insulin is a very, very interconnected problem. And I have a note here. Why does being fat play a big role? Well, fat cells leak fatty acids and produce inflammation. Both of these things negatively affect glucose metabolism. Wow, that's the root cause that I talk about in every video nowadays. Glucose metabolism, which means that insulin won't work well as well. Because if insulin's not working well, your glucose metabolism is not working well. They go hand in hand. Look up things like the Randall cycle. Your mitochondria are going to struggle with both fats and carbs. Think of fats as kind of gunking up the system. Your body, your mitochondria can handle one or the other pretty easily, but once you're metabolically dysfunctional, if you try and put fats and carbs together into the mitochondria, you're going to have a bad time. So it becomes quite clear that the main mechanism of action in gout is the high insulin that is reabsorbing uric acid instead of clearing it. Another reason why fixing insulin resistance and becoming insulin sensitive is the key. You can think of things like fruitarians that claim that they're following their diet for a year or two can completely heal insulin resistance. And that's a fact. Okay, and that's also why you hear these miraculous stories with people like the rice diet, the Kempfner rice diet. That's a big one. And even fruitarian type eating, that's another big way to heal. But the problem is that it doesn't work for most people chronically ill because their insulin resistance is so bad that once your body starts falling apart and then you pray and jump onto this fruitarian diet hoping that it fixes everything, but it actually makes things worse. Understand? In a prior video, I talked about this hole that you can fall in that you can't kind of climb your way out. Once you're in that hole, putting in more sugars, hoping to break through the insulin resistance is no bueno. You're actually going to make things worse, most likely. Okay, let's move on to fructose, because fructose is a big one. Fructose, which usually in table sugar, for example, you have 50% fructose, 50% sucrose, or is it glucose fructose? Usually it's metabolized almost entirely in the liver. Okay, so if the fructose, think of it as a liver, while the glucose part of it sort of bypasses the liver and goes into the blood. And if you're really insulin resistant, fructose is going to raise your intrahepatic triglyceride levels, so the fat in the liver, which is not a good look when your liver can't handle it. And it's also why fructose is demonized by so many people, especially in the low-carb world. The longer you're low-carb, the more you demonize fructose. There's a correlation. Basically, it worsens insulin resistance if you're already insulin resistant. And if you're making the insulin worse, you're making your kidney excretion of uric acid worse. So fructose, for someone who's really suffering with gout, is kind of a horrible combo that you need to be aware of. Does that make sense? So basically what we have to think of is sugar means an acute uric acid spike and then chronic insulin resistance driven hyperuricemia. And here I have another note. While anyone who knows about bioenergetics and glucose metabolism knows that fructose is not the enemy if you're metabolically healthy. It's still being demonized though. Do you see why? If you are metabolically damaged, diseased with insulin resistance, fructose will hurt more than anything because of how quickly it creates uric acid. Now it raises the insulin level. And how quickly it can cause non-alcohol fatty liver disease and visceral fat buildup around your organs, However, on the journey to healing insulin resistance, you will have to bump into varying amounts of fructose. You cannot fix insulin resistance without giving the body carbs. You can't just take it away because your body is just going to get worse and worse at using carbs. They go hand in hand, and that's why you need to understand strategies of doing it correctly. Okay, let's move on. Faulty glucose oxidation ties it all together. Okay, so one, insulin-resistant tissues shift towards incomplete glucose oxidation. And what happens when your insulin-resistant tissues and mitochondria switch from glucose oxidation to more fat oxidation? They also start creating more lactate. hopefully, if you've been sick for a really long time, you've probably went down the lactate rabbit hole and you're probably thought, oh man, definitely, why do I feel so sore after working out? Why is it so hard? It's got to be, you've kind of found the clue that led you to lactate, but you didn't really understand it. Just remember, when a cell uses energy correctly and the glucose oxidation, the whole respiration cycle works correctly for ATP, you don't get lactate. But once it starts to fall apart and it becomes sluggish, lactate is a very common end result. So lactate, once you're already metabolically unhealthy and then trying to exercise and creating lots of lactate, it's competing with uric acid for excretion out of the kidneys. So remember how we said once you try to shift to low carb, you've got ketones that compete with it? Well, you've also got lactate that competes with it. And lactate's another thing that if you've been on the keto diet for too long, you're going to be dealing with lactate issues. So eventually, if things get really bad, you might even get gout on low carb. And if you're getting gout on low carb, you're pretty far down the wrong path. It's going to be even harder to get out of there. So chronic high lactate, high insulin, high fructose, and fructose derives uric acid. You picture that in your mind. So I have another note here. It becomes clearer and clearer. If you can fix insulin resistance, you will fix gout. You will most likely also start fixing all of your other problems. The key is to know where to start. Sometimes you're so far gone that switching to carbs is not the answer. You need bridging solutions. For example, you start with preparing for a dry fast. This is going to help reset the system, kind of like wiping a slate clean. And then you get a cascade of stem cell regeneration. And don't sleep on that. The stem cells are a big part of healing. We really need them. Then you pair it with therapies. You need to know when you need to use T3 therapy. You need to know when you need to use HGH therapy, when you need to use peptide therapy, when you need to use bendazole and ivermectin. There's a lot. And then what kind of supplements you need to pair with it and at what time. So life starts getting better and better once you figure this stuff out. You're going to be improving slowly your insulin resistance, and the cascade of improvements are all going to start happening. And your life's going to get brighter and brighter. Your energy is going to start coming back more and more. It's a very beautiful thing, but it can get complicated. For example, I was just talking with someone recently, and I was telling them that to date, currently, I have something like 21, maybe up to like 25 different variations of the Scorch protocol, because no one person is going to go through this exactly the same way. The Scorch protocol are these like generic guardrails, a generic path, but yet for everybody, it's got to veer a bit left, a bit right. It's got to go up and down to all come back and get you fully healed. Nobody is going to have the exact same path as somebody else. That's an important thing to keep in mind, and why I wish that I could just create one protocol, like a specific step-by-step that works for everybody, but that's not how it works. And I hope you can understand that. And the people who really understand this and are very deep into metabolism and metabolic therapies and really understanding the whole system, or just on the journey, I hope that the information I provide is enough clues to kind of feed your own path, and you'll figure it out yourself. If not, just book with me, spend some money, and hopefully I have some room to fit you in. Okay, let's keep moving on. Why meat, red wine, and beer are unfairly blamed. So these things contain purines. So if your body's already messed up, obviously more purines are just going to make it worse. But the problem is people think that the purines are causing the gout. While it has some elements of truth to it, I hope you're finally understanding that that's not the reason, because your excretion rate or even formation rate of purines is the same as the next person. You're just not excreting them correctly because of your high insulin, because of insulin resistance. So the kidneys aren't clearing it. When sensitivity is restored, even temporarily restored in the form of keto, fasting, or metformin, the temporary solutions, then they can eat meat again and everything's completely fine. And that's why you get people on keto that are basically eating steak and drinking red wine again without any gout attacks. And then they think that keto healed them, but they're just living in a temporary Band-Aid solution state, which is fine for some people. But the problem is you're not healing the underlying cause. And when things get worse, what are you going to do? Because keto is not going to work for you anymore. I hope that makes sense. The takeaway is it was never really the meat. The mix of meat and sugar while in a metabolically diseased body causes these problems. And it all happens through a mix of stress, viruses, bacteria, PUFAs, excessive fat, and chemicals in our food. It all comes together in a perfect storm. And most people will kind of know when that perfect storm hit them, when that extremely stressful event in their life just brought everything together and collapsed the body. And now, how do we get out of there? It can be kind of tough. So we're going to just finish off on mentioning that dry fasting in T3 therapy is an aggressive reversal strategy. These are two pillars of the whole process. That's the starting point for everybody. Okay, you need to understand this. You need to understand that dry fasting has a massive drop in insulin, near zero, strong autophagy and mitochondrial turnover, critical parts of the whole process. It has profound lowering of lactate and inflammation in the body. Gets rid of cytokines, eats them all up, eats up lactate. And then uric acid might even rise during dry fasting, but then crashes down because there is what? No insulin. So huge. And then the T3 therapy, what does that do? Increases mitochondrial expression, increases GLUT5 and GLUT4 expression in your muscles, which is so important for being able to absorb glucose, and insulin together from the blood and actually put it into your muscle, especially into your skeletal muscle or glycogen. It raises your basal metabolic rate, which improves lactate clearance, which improves immune system. There's so many things that are very important. It improves your insulin sensitivity just in general, and it increases renal uric acid excretion. It just makes the kidneys function so much better. These are very important things, very important to put these puzzles together, and a foundation of the Scorch protocol. So let's leave it off by just saying that even though the pillars are technically simple, they need to be adapted to your situation. And you can read more about this once you start understanding the concepts of the Scorch protocol. And if you just want to speed through it and work with me, then book a call under the members section. They do fill up pretty quickly. I honestly don't have room and time to take up more people, but I'll fit you in somehow. If you really need the help, send me an email, tell me your story, and we'll work together. So good luck on your dry fasting journey, and see you later. The world is not what it seems. You can liberate yourself. The Scorch protocol is built around dry fasting. Subscribe if you want access to a private Discord server, access to dry fasting plans and charts, codes for discounts, things like human growth hormone, ivermectin, slow release T3, and more, or just to support the site. Your health is just around the corner.